For many, the War of 1812 is a forgotten conflict. It stuck between the Revolution and the Civil War in American history, and it happened at the same time as Napoleon's conquests in Europe, all of which received far more attention. But, for the residents of Baltimore, like your humble narrator, one battle in that war was our city's finest hour, and many a Marylander will get misty-eyed thinking about it. This is the story of a few heroic Baltimore boys that I hold near and dear to my heart. Nestled on a small grassy peninsula in southern Baltimore sits an edifice of brick and iron called Fort Mchenry. The earthworks surrounding its ramparts bristle with cannons, and though those guns have long fallen silent, this place has quite a story to tell. As the War of 1812 drew to a close in 1814, the British burned Washington, D.C., and were marching north. Their goal was to capture the port of Baltimore, then one of the nation's largest and most prosperous seaports. They'd hoped their burning of Washington would demoralize the American defenders. They were wrong. The fate of the newborn nation rested upon Baltimore's defenders. At North Point, 2,000 infantrymen. At Fort Mchenry, another 1,000 men with 20 guns. Reinforcing the men at North Point and Hampstead Hill were an additional 8,000 civilian militia and more than 100 guns. The Americans had numbers and 18 months of preparation, during which the men stationed there built up earthwork defenses around the city and the fort. But the British infantry, led by Major General Sir Robert Ross, and numbering 5,000 total, were by far better trained and better equipped. The linchpin of the defense was the fort guarding the mouth of Baltimore's harbor. Its defenders, led by Major George Armistead, were up against the most powerful navy in the world. The British had brought 19 warships to the party. Among them were a rocket ship and 5 long-range bomb vessels to shell the port. They also had 7 frigates and 4 schooners, all led by Vice Admiral Sir Alexander Cochrane. The bravery and sacrifice of Fort McHenry's defenders played a pivotal role in the battle, and the enormous flag they flew over the fort became the subject of America's national anthem. Because, if they could hold, the rest of the defense, led by Generals Samuel Smith and John Stricker, would be able to use their superior numbers against the British without fear of being shelled from their flank. When the city's defenders learned of the British arrival, they sunk a line of merchant ships at the entrance to the harbor. The Royal Navy would have to deal with the fort before trying to clear the blockage. Otherwise, the fort's artillery would unleash hell on the British ships. Any ship foolish enough to enter the narrow inlet to the harbor, while the Americans held Fort McHenry, would be subject to a close-range bombardment. Firing back would have been a hopeless endeavor. Fort McHenry is a short, stout, 5-pointed star fort, surrounded by earthworks to blunt the impact of any cannonballs. It was built to withstand the worst that any vessel of the early 19th century could throw at it. In the opening salvo of the attack on Baltimore on September 12th, the British landed 5,000 men away from the city and marched in. They first encountered American forces at North Point. General Smith had sent Stricker with 3,000 men to engage the British and buy time for the rest of the city's defenders to finish fortifying it. The resistance was much harsher than the British had anticipated. In the fighting at North Point, the British lost more than 300 men, 46 killed and 295 wounded. Among the dead was the British commander Ross, who had been killed by an American sharpshooter, likely from the 5th Maryland Militia. Ross was replaced by Colonel Arthur Brooke, but by the time the British were ready to press on, the Americans had made an organized retreat to the heavily fortified Rogers Bastion on Hampstead Hill, which is now part of a local park called Patterson Park. At dawn on September 13th, the British launched a 2-pronged attack on the defenders. the infantry made probing advances on Hampstead Hill and its 3-mile-wide earthwork fortifications. But each time they were met by withering cannon fire from the 100 guns along the earthworks and the thousands of infantrymen manning them. The British did manage to outflank the Americans on the right and capture some of the outer defenses, but they hadn't anticipated this sort of resistance. So, Brooke decided the best course of action was to let the Royal Navy shell Fort McHenry, so he could advance with artillery support from the water. Meanwhile, the British fleet opened fire on Fort McHenry from well outside the range of the fort's cannons. For the next 25 hours, the British would relentlessly bombard the fort. Between 1,500 and 1,800 cannonballs were discharged at McHenry, but the fort held, and took plenty of shots back. Several women from Baltimore helped out too, running supplies for the men and water to keep the cannons cool to the fort. Armistead's earthwork fortifications had made the fort nigh impervious to the British guns. Throughout the whole of that 25-hour bombardment, which included an attempted amphibious invasion by some naval infantry, only 4 men at the fort were killed and 24 wounded. They weren't able to do much damage to the British fleet, but neither could the fleet do much damage to them. The battle at the mouth of the harbor became a stalemate. Back at the redoubt, Brooke was under orders not to launch a full-scale assault on the city unless there were fewer than 2,000 men at Fort McHenry. Given how well Armistead's men had defended it, the British couldn't be sure. And on the morning of September 14th, through the dawn's early light, the Stars and Stripes was still flying proudly over Fort McHenry. Much to the relief of one lawyer from Frederick called Francis Scott Key, who had gone to negotiate with the British and spent the whole of the battle on the deck of a British warship. He penned a poem called Defense on Fort McHenry, which is now the lyrics to the American national anthem. The British had to retreat fully from Baltimore, and by the 15th, they had regrouped and decided to move on New Orleans, one of the infant United States' other major ports. While the war had ended with a British withdrawal in the Treaty of Ghent on December 24, 1814, news did not reach the Americas in time, and the defense of New Orleans, led by future President Andrew Jackson, would become the more famous battle of the war, overshadowing the heroic efforts of Baltimore's defenders. Still, if the British managed to capture Baltimore, the new nation would likely have been demoralized, and then who knows what would have happened. As far as I see it, the future of the United States was won a second time on that tiny grassy peninsula in southern Baltimore. And you can go there today. If you ever find yourself in the mid-Atlantic, Fort McHenry is definitely worth a visit. You'll get a fantastic view of the city and of Baltimore's harbor, and the fort that stands today is nearly identical to the one that Armistead's men took a stand in. The only changes really are some upgraded cannons and a handful of additional structures from the Civil War era. But that's another far darker chapter in Baltimore's history. Do yourself a favor and get a crab cake while you're here. You might think you've had crab cakes other places, but you haven't. Baltimore crab cakes are better. No contest. You can't debate me on this. Wash it down with a natty bow, have a burger cookie for dessert, and you'll see why they call it Charm City. Yes, it's shitty beer. And no, I don't care. Nobody here does. We drink it, and we like it. Then you might as well take a trip down to Washington, D.C., to see the famous Star-Spangled Banner itself at the Smithsonian American History Museum. It's only about an hour south of Baltimore. I like D.C., but the food's not as good. Still, there's a little bar near the Capitol building called Hamilton's. The cheeseburgers are delicious. Check it out if you're in the area. That's all for me today. Renegade Historian signing off. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and have a wonderful day, everyone.